I recently moved to this area, and the house is nice. As I've said before, the closer to the main road in this small town, the better. It's not a bad spot either, and we're right on the corner, so I can look out the window and watch the kids get off the bus. It's 2 bedrooms. It used to be 3, but we pulled the bed out of that room after my daughter went to stay with her dad. Now that room is for the computer and various instruments my girlfriend plays. I honestly love this house. There's just one issue. We live right across the street from a church. Now, some would think that that was actually nice, and I have had people say that. It was just that most would be right, but we're pagan. I know it's not a big deal, but being right across the street from this church is no cakewalk. The front of our house has mud splattered all over it. Pretty sure someone saw the sticker on the door that read of some pig in his junk about God or something. We think they didn't care for that and got frisky and threw mud. Now that's not really a big deal, and I honestly think the people of the church had nothing to do with it. My girlfriend seems to think they did, but I don't indulge her on it. There's more to this story, more that my girlfriend actually doesn't know. She works all day, and I stay home with our 2 boys. I mostly stick to the house, only stepping outside maybe once a week to play with the dogs or the boys. I'm not much for outdoor fun, and I'm very introverted. One day in particular, I was out on the front yard letting the boys look at spiders when I noticed something odd about the church across the street. Cars were lined in a row as if there was a service that day. It's not one of those churches where they hold anything on a Tuesday, so it was odd. I dropped the thought a few seconds later when I told myself they must have been doing a fundraiser or something. Churches do that, right? I pointed out a beautiful cabinet spider to my youngest, Neil. We were checking her out, and I was explaining how they could catch food when I heard a commotion across the street. I looked up to see a group of people all shuffling from the church in a hurry. It looked like a family with a few added friends. There were 2 small girls looking to be twins, their parents, and 2 tall, lanky old men that looked half dead. My boys looked at them, mostly because I was just staring. Now, my sweetest little weirdo called out to them. He yelled a hello and began waving. I waved too and called out an apology. Seemed like the right thing to do. The parents kept walking and never looked up, never waved or anything of the sort. I wasn't sure if they had heard, but then again, the 2 girls looked at us, and one of them waved. She was quickly stopped by one of the walking corpses that followed her. Was this like some weird cult stuff? Anyway, I thought this was a bit odd, so I told the boys to go inside while I went over and spoke to the parents. There, in the hopes of getting them to come by and have a cup of coffee and invite the girls to play. It was neighborly. The boys went in, leaving JJ in charge, and I strolled through the ditch across the road and over the little parking lot. I waved at the father who was about to get into the car. This was all new to me, but I thought, why not let my boys make some new friends? The father, this man, was less friendly. He just shot me a glare as I got close enough to speak to him. I mustered up all my big girl superpowers and spoke, "Hey there, I'm Sarah. I live right over here. I see you and your wife have 2 lovely girls." I looked at the twins and smiled. Everything was normal for 2 seconds, and the smaller one spoke to me in such a defeated, tired little voice. "We're not for sale." I chuckled a bit and turned to the father. "Okay, weird kids. Well, she sure is something," I sang out in that southerly way. The man just glared at me, then looked to one of the walking dead that had escorted his children. "They're not for sale," one tall man said in such a dull, ugly voice. It almost hurt to hear. I was confused. I looked to all of them and looked back at the father. "I don't want to buy them," I said. "I just thought that you and your wife could come by, have some coffee, and let the kids play together. Sound fun?" That's when the woman, the mother, got out of the car. She took off her sunglasses and glared at me. Her voice reminded me of the lady that asks for the manager. "My girls wouldn't be caught dead with them 2 boys of yours. I've seen you, all of you lesbians, heathens, devil worshippers. God is watching, little girl, and he does not like what he sees. He will strike you down as his name." She held up her hand as if she was about to slap me. Instead, she held it up to the sky and kept on with her ramble. It dawned on me as she cast me out in the name of the Lord that they thought I wanted the girls' souls. It was then confirmed when the woman screamed, "And you will not buy my children. Their souls belong to him, in Jesus' name." They honestly thought I wanted to buy their kids' souls or something. I never laughed so hard in my life. I apologized to them for bugging them and for upsetting them, and then returned home, all the while listening to that woman screech about God and this and that. I got back inside, looked to my boys who had been watching through the window the whole time, and now, as always, had something to say. "Mommy, if you buy those kids, can I keep one in my closet?" Thank you, whatever God is out there, for giving me such a weird child. Some background. I live in a rural county in Texas. I live in a rural suburb about 1.5 miles away from my grandparents, who live on an expansive longhorn cattle ranch. My grandparents are currently on a trip to Michigan, and they needed someone to watch their house, take care of their diabetic dog, and water the garden for a while. I loved being alone in the country, and I wouldn't be that far from my mom and stepdad, so I agreed to do it for them. The first 2 days were fine. It was on the third day that this began. It was about 8:30 at night. I had just made myself dinner, a Lunchable, and was ready to sit down in the living room and watch TV for a couple of hours until I went to bed. The recliner I was sat in my grandparents' living room, was directly beside their large glass doors, and I could see into their backyard and into their ranch from my seat. Just past the fence in the backyard were about 12 deer, which was odd, considering there's an insane amount of deer where I live. I watched them for a second when all of a sudden, I felt a wave of fear rush over me. It was like my brain stopped seeing the deer as something harmless, and instead, it became a very imposing sight. I scanned over the deer, and my eyes landed on one in particular. I noticed it because, even though it was a doe, it was a good bit taller than the others. It seemed to be oddly bulky and slightly misshapen. I watched it for about a second before, out of nowhere, its head shot up in the grass, and it stared directly at me. I hadn't been moving, and both my dogs were inside with me, asleep. But I knew that it was focusing in on me. We stared for about a second before it started to whip its head around in a really unnatural motion. The closest analogy I could make is one of video game glitches, where the head of a character starts moving around wildly. It did this for another second before putting its head back down into the grass like nothing had happened. At this point, I knew something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. I called my mom, who was out fishing with my stepdad, and told her I was going home early because I was freaking out. I suffer from anxiety and can sometimes have panic attacks, so she understood, and I hauled ass to my car. All I grabbed was my phone, my Lunchables, and an Eeyore blanket that I had brought from my house. I don't really know why I grabbed the extra 2 things besides my phone, but I wasn't really thinking clearly. I'm usually a very careful driver, especially on my grandparents' shoddy gravel driveway, but I knew I had to get off their property, or else I would be in real danger. My car is shitty, with the driver's side window permanently down. The entire time I drove up their half-mile-long driveway, I heard a sound coming just off from behind my car. It sounded like if a mammal tried to replicate the sound of a cicada, very throaty and unnatural. And it was the same constant distance from my car the entire drive off the property. Right in front of the gate, before going back out onto the road, were a few of my grandparents' cows. I laid eyes on a black figure amongst them, and almost like an optical illusion, it changed to be a full front profile of a longhorn. I wouldn't have thought this with my eyes playing tricks on me because I was in a panic if it wasn't for the horns. When I saw the cow, it was a black figure with no horns, but within a second, I spotted it and suddenly had 2 giant horns on either side of its head. I managed to drive home, but I still felt extremely unsafe. My instincts were telling me that if I went inside, I'd be cornering myself. At this point, I was sitting in my driveway, near hysterics, and on the phone with one of my friends, who I'll call Hope. Hope is extremely knowledgeable with this kind of stuff and a true believer in the supernatural, and I knew she would be the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. She talked to me and calmed me down, and I explained the deer to her, and she got pretty freaked out and told me she knew what it probably was. I told her that I didn't want to know because I already had an idea as to what it might be, and her confirmation would only freak me out more. At this point, I made up my mind to go to my closest neighbor's house. I knew if I stayed alone, I'd be putting myself in danger. So cue me crying and clutching an Eeyore blanket as I strolled up to my neighbor's backyard, weeping and apologizing profusely. Thankfully, my neighbors are saints, and they took me inside and calmed me down. They stayed up with me for a good hour until my mom and stepdad got home from the lake, and I felt safe enough to go home because I had finally fully calmed down. I decided to go back to the ranch with my mom to clean up the mess I had left when I booked it out of there. But by the time we were there, even remotely close to the ranch, I felt the panic return. We got halfway down the driveway before I told my mom I couldn't do it and had to go back. My mom was still planning to go back after she dropped me off at home, but I knew she'd be in danger if she went back alone. So I told her about the deer, and I told her I really didn't want her to go back there that night, and she agreed. Hope has an older sister who is extremely well versed in the supernatural, and when she informed her of my experience, her advice was for me to never go back. This wasn't entirely realistic to me since they are my grandparents, and I did leave most of my stuff there, but I tried to take her warning as seriously as possible and decided to greatly limit my time there and not go back alone until my grandparents returned the next day, which is today at about noon. I had to go back to gather my stuff and check on my grandparents' diabetic dog and let the bigger outside dog in so he would be safe from the heat. The feeling of the place was still tense and strange, but not terrifying. Later, at about 8 o'clock, I had to go back again, this time to feed the dog, let the other one out, and water the plants. I was way more hesitant about it, but my mom forced me to go. I was keeping my cool pretty well, until as we were going down the driveway, I saw a deer standing in the road. I immediately felt the fear of the previous night and started freaking out, telling my mom that I couldn't do it and that she had to turn around. As I was freaking out with my mom distracted, trying to calm me down, this fucking deer arched its back like when a calf stretches. That tipped me over the edge into full hysterics, but my mom still refused to take me home. My mom went inside my grandparents' house, and I stayed in the truck and called Hope again. I told her what I saw, and she tried to calm me down, but nothing really worked. As I was freaking out on the phone, I saw a black shadow dart into and then out of the rearview mirror. That was it. I called my mom and was screaming for her to come back inside and take me home. Even during normal panic attacks, it never reaches this point. My mom was screaming so harshly, and my vocal cords hurt. She tried to convince me to come inside, and eventually, she decided to take me home. I was hyperventilating and sobbing until the moment I arrived back. At this point, I'm terrified, and I don't know what to do. I've never experienced anything like this before, and although I hope this is going to be an isolated incident, I can't be sure. For now, I'm going to try to stay away from my grandparents' ranch. That really isn't realistic, as I could use any advice you're willing to give. My name is Carlos. I am now currently 14 years old. The sighting happens while I was backpacking in rural Arkansas, high in the mountains. Me and my friends, which for confidential reasons I won't say their names, but let's call them Jerome, John, Caleb, and my crush who I will call Laura, went backpacking with my fellow church youth. On the very first day backpacking, I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, like the forest was empty, kinda. It was just silence. But I ignored it and put it off as maybe it was just very quiet here. But being a country boy, I should have known better. After long and tiring 5 hours of walking, we finally decided to stop and rest for the night. I will explain how the surrounding area looked like because it is important. We were separated into two groups, guys and girls. Us guys, we slept in a clearing near a massive hill, while the girls slept under a ridge of a cliff. On the right of both camps was a river. Also, in between the camps was a ravine. Us guys, being young and stupid, decided to explore before it was too dark. We ended up finding this cave around 30 feet away from our camp. After exploring the cave, which was empty, we decided to go eat dinner. For some reason, we didn't make a fire. After eating, our counselor told us that we needed to have a buddy system when we used the bathrooms because it was hunting season. After the meeting, we went to bed. That night, I woke up with a strong urge to pee. Being the good friend I am, I didn't wake up any of my sleeping friends. As I climbed up that massive hill to pee behind a tree or near the top, now I know that was dumb. But hey, you'd rather go pee in a ravine. As I was going up, I heard a branch break, but I brushed it off as some kind of nocturnal animal. During mid-pee, I heard a low growl. It was like a guttural growl. I was in mid-pee. I couldn't stop. As soon as I finished peeing, I raced down the hill and made the mistake of turning around. I saw a massive, easily 6-foot-tall, very pale humanoid-looking creature with huge black eyes, which were fixated on me. I immediately ran to my tent and passed out from fright. The next morning as we were leaving, I saw in that cave a pale-looking face peering out at me. My friends didn't believe me, but one of my friends came up to me and told me that he saw it because he takes medication for his depression, and he thought he was hallucinating. In the early 1980s, I was about 8 years old, and my father decided to take me to deer camp for the first time. We were in far northern Wisconsin, where deer camp is sort of like a religious experience, especially our deer camp. Anyway, when we got there, my dad leaned in about 3 inches from my face and gave me a thinly veiled threat there. He called it a piece of advice that what was done at camp stays at camp, and especially not to tell my mother what I was about to witness. It was mostly just a bunch of middle-aged drunks in long johns, telling dirty jokes and playing cards. But to my eyes, it was the best place on earth. The first morning, my dad wakes me up early to go hunting with his best friend, who had cancer and wasn't expecting to make it back for next year. We were way back in the woods in a standoff when an unseasonal thunderstorm rolls in and chased us back to the truck. On our way back to camp, my father slams on the brakes because he sees something in the middle of the road. It was raining so hard that we couldn't tell what it was from inside, so my dad went to take a look. A couple of minutes later, he climbs back into the truck and simply says, "She's dead." We raced for miles to the nearest phone to call the police. It turns out that she was heavily pregnant, put her car in the ditch about 5 miles away, and had died from exposure when she became lost looking for help. My main memory of this, though, is bursting out crying on the way home because I just knew I couldn't keep this big of a secret from my mother. My dad simply told me that there were exceptions to every rule, and this was definitely one of them. I was sitting outside my work, having a smoke at 4 a.m. Not a soul in sight, and a man came up to me, asked if I had a spare cigarette. I politely declined. Normally this just elicits some grumbling, and they amble off. Not this time. Buddy decided to dig in his heels. He had all his earthly belongings on his back, and a gigantic glass bottle of vodka that he started swinging around. He also had the kind of eyes that will give a lion tamer the heebie-jeebies. Not an ideal combination in someone who's getting up in your unarmed face. "You better give me a smoke," he said. "No, dude, sorry," I said. "Give me a smoke. You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted. He starts to loom over me, getting a bit too far into my space bubble. I stood up, all 5'3" of me. The only things I had going for me were steel toe cap boots and a really bitchy look. The man backed up a step, and then came back even closer. He was directly in my way back to the door. He took my motion as a threat as he immediately ramped up his act. "If you don't give me a cigarette, I'm gonna end you. No one will find you. Now look me in the eyes, woman." "I'm looking at you in the eyes," I replied firmly, planting my feet and giving him my best graveyard shift stare. Anyone who's worked night shifts will know what that stare is. He kept insisting I looked him in the eye, and I kept replying just as fast that I already was. And what was he gonna do about it? "Don't try me! I'll drag you by your hair to the bushes, and then you'll see," he threatened, getting closer still and holding the vodka bottle up. This is when I started getting really loud, Get out of my face and back off! Get out of here now! I yelled. In true predator fashion, he got all nervous at the sudden yelling, and while he kept threatening me with all sorts of heinous things and was looking around quickly for any witnesses, this is when I knew I was in trouble if someone didn't come along. I cannot emphasize enough how creepy this guy was being. I've actually abbreviated most of what he said, but luckily, my coworker finally heard the commotion, then came barreling out already on the phone to the police. The man started threatening her as well, then realized who she was on the phone with, and quickly walked away, slurring more insults as he went. The police came, and I gave a detailed description, but they never found him. And sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if my coworker hadn't come out when she did. This happened years ago, but haunts me to this day. Back when I was in middle school, I lived next to a small neighborhood. All I had to do was hop the fence, and I'd be in the neighborhood where all my friends lived. We were all between the ages of 12 to 13, and there were 5 of us. One of the houses we were in always had a backyard on the edge of the woods. We had created trails through it, complete with bridges over the creek that led to a reservoir of sorts, where all the rainwater went, as well as the water that drained from the sewers. I say sewers, but it's runoff from the street that we used, the tunnels under the road during intense games of manhunt. We called that place the Wall. The wall backed up quite literally onto our house in the neighborhood and the next street over, and we could clearly see houses through the trees in any direction we looked. So, it was not like we were ever far. Besides the trails we took, there was a main exit along the fence to the house aforementioned that led straight into the heart of the neighborhood. Now, the wall was right by the next street over on our side. Why the wall sat there were 3 houses. In one of those houses lived a very well-known police officer, whose kids we were friends with. The opposite side had some massive farmland to the left, and a heavily wooded area to the right, complete with its own empty, boarded-up, creepy house that couldn't be seen from the road unless it was winter. No one had lived there or been in there for years, so like I said, I'm just trying to paint a picture here so you can understand. We were very, very close to other homes, which made this story an odd one. One day, my friend and I, just 2 girls, decided to go to the wall, taking the familiar trails through the woods, and we made it to the wall. Weeks prior to this, a group of us had been trying to make a bridge so we could continue our work between picking up branches and heaving stones when we noticed something coming from the woods across the street. A man. This man was dressed head to toe in camouflage, typical hunting gear that I've seen before. The weird thing was, he had a shotgun in his hand in a residential area. Luckily, we noticed him before he did us, and I'm so glad we did. When he noticed us, his eyes locked on both of us, and his pace began to quicken. He made a beeline straight towards us. He never said a word or even lowered his weapon. It was just in his hands, ready to give at any moment. We snap out of it and take the exit, sprinting into the heart of the neighborhood, running straight to my friend's house to tell someone. We tell her dad immediately, and he goes to check it out, only to find that no one was there. Not a trace. I don't know where or how that man was out of sight so quickly. Her dad wasted no time and was down there in seconds. The wooded area where the man came from was not large, at least not large enough to ever consider hunting on it, and it was definitely not hunting land. It is an extremely residential area along an elementary school that we used to walk to in less than 5 minutes. So I never understood why the man was out there, especially since there was a cop who lived right next door to where we were. To the hunter, I hope we never meet. That incident scared us so badly we stopped playing in the woods and never returned to the wall. I've had the fortune of traveling all across this great and wonderful nation, but I've seen something while camping that makes me reconsider mountain folk in Georgia. Now, I love my home state. I love exploring the vast amounts of wilderness we have here. I just happen to carry a gun at all times whilst exploring. Now, I didn't then. I went to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a friend to hike a week without cell phones, we called it. Except we had his satellite phone just in case of an emergency. We hiked as far as we pleased and fished and found water, of course. We also had a GPS and a compass to ensure that we don't get lost. So, we're on our next and last day of hiking back. We come across a small clearing in a valley that has a nice-sized pond. We stop to set up camp and fish. As night falls and our fire is fading, with our bellies full of fish, wild onion, potatoes, and wine, we lay down to sleep. And then I hear it. My friend is fast asleep, and the sound doesn't wake him. There's something outside, close by, but not distant enough. A moment of stupidity and adrenaline hits me as I grab our machete and exit the tent, brandishing my lackluster weapon. The sound of that of a drum is being played with skill and expertise that only a child of the basic idea of rhythm can possess. Upon exiting the tent, I see a fire and a woman across the pond. She's not creating the drum sound. Instead, she has a black kettle hoisted above her fire, and she's stirring it. She turns her face to me, and I see that she must be as old as the mountains themselves. Her clothes are nothing but rags, yet she has an aura about her, one that is dark and filled with terrible wisdom and knowledge. Her ancient eyes meet mine, and I become paralyzed by fear. The drumming grows louder and then stops suddenly, and she's gone, and so is the fire, and any evidence that she even existed. I start a fire again and do not sleep. Upon hiking out of the woods and back into our car, we decide to stay at a hotel in a small town nearby since I was exhausted from staying awake. Of course, I had told my tale to my friend when he woke, and we packed quickly and moved as fast as our legs would carry us. We got to the hotel, which thankfully had a restaurant and bar. I told my tale to some locals, and the consensus was that I had met the mountain witch whose land I was trespassing on, and we were only alive because I had stayed awake. They may have been jesting, but they seemed very serious. I now carry a firearm whenever I hike, mostly because it makes me feel safer. And whether you believe my tale or not makes no difference to me, dear listener. But there are dark and ancient things in this world. Stay safe. I live in a pretty small and rural town, and most of the neighborhoods are somewhat in the woods. My high school soccer team was having an end-of-the-season party at one of the players' houses in one of these wooded neighborhoods. Towards the end of the night, someone mentioned a house towards the end of the road, past a curve somewhat cut off by woods, that a doctor owned but was never there, leaving it somewhat abandoned. We all thought it would be a good idea to check it out. About 8 or 9 of us walked over there in the pitch darkness, and the house had some small lights, but no one was home. We go to the backyard where there was just a pool and started looking around. Behind the backyard, there's only woods and a little bit of woods on the side as well. It's a big property, so we split up in pairs of 2 or 3, with 2 groups walking around the house and one trying to get inside it or on the roof. They weren't that smart. They couldn't get inside or on the roof, so we just sat in the backyard, talking about random stuff and joking around. When I noticed a sound that was reminiscent of a clacking sound on the roof, it started sounding like someone was walking back and forth on the roof. I looked up, thinking that someone had made it up, and I see a silhouette of what I thought was one of the kids' faces, but it was pitch black with bright white eyes. I looked around to see who was missing, but everyone was there. Then I looked back at the roof, and the sound and the thing were gone. I ignored it, thinking it was just a squirrel or something, and carried on with the conversation. Later, a friend of mine and I decided to talk on one of the sides of the house. As soon as we crossed the corner, we thought we heard a deer walking through the trees. As we walked closer to get a better look, we heard leaves crunching all around us. We started getting a little spooked and turned around to walk back. When we got closer to the house, we heard leaves crunching right behind us. We turned around to see a black stick figure standing not 10 feet away, motionless between the swaying trees, staring at us with the same white eyes I saw on the roof earlier. We both lost our minds and told everyone we were heading back to the other kid's house. The entire time we were walking off the property and down the driveway, we felt like we were being followed and still heard leaves crunching as if someone were right behind us. As soon as we stepped off the driveway onto the main road, we felt an instant relief and didn't hear being followed anymore. We didn't turn around once the entire way back, not until we stepped foot onto the other kid's yard. Ever since then, I will occasionally drive by that house, trying to see if I spot what I saw that night. I've only ever seen a pair of white eyes in the woods that one time. The doctor has never returned, and now I think I know why.